The summer of '55 was an exceedingly hot summer. I know at one point when I was working in Westfield that the official temperature at Barnes was either 102 or 103. And it was a hurricane season, and the hurricanes headed for New England. A week before, at the beginning of August, it was Hurricane Connie.
The first major hurricane of the year rips into the coast of the Carolinas, packing winds of more than 100 miles an hour. Capricious Connie suddenly veers north and west. In her reign of terror, Connie carves her tragic niche with a total of 43 dead and damage estimated at 15 millions.
Well, it rained about 4¼ inches around here from the side slaps of Hurricane Connie. So the ground here was utterly saturated after having an early dry period. Well, we had rain and rain and more rain.
As far as we were concerned, it was a very quiet night.
And then at 2:15, we heard sirens.
But about 5 o'clock in the morning, the telephone rang. And it was Tony Lipsky, engineer of the Easthampton rubber thread plant. And he said, the waters of Nashawannuck Pond are backing up into the basement of the Easthampton Rubber Thread Company. So I drove up Route 10 until I got to, I guess we old-timers would call it Coleman's Bridge, where the Manhan crosses Route 10. And the whole valley was afloat. So I couldn't go through there. And we figured the only way we could get across the Manhan River was to walk the railroad trestle across the Manhan and Gun Road. The two are together there. We got into Easthampton just at 7 o'clock, just in time to see a car drive across. Nashawannuck Pond was flooding now. Drive across Cottage Street and almost got swept away. There was a policeman there and he said that's the last car across. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the earthen dam had completely eroded and the weight of the pond fell against one of the mills. The river goes underneath the mill, and the facing of that mill in one section collapsed, exposing all the 4 floors. It was an interesting day, and one I'll never forget.
We were really isolated because the Connecticut River overflowed, and blocked off Montown, so you couldn't get to Hamp or Holyoke.
I wanted to make sure my parents were okay, and we kept calling on the telephone, and they kept saying, well, no one answers. And that didn't seem to make any sense for 3 days, so we finally called someone else and then discovered that the reason nobody was answering my parents' phone is that they lived down on Spring Street in the southern part of town, and the dam, the Nashawannuck Pond, had gone out, taken Cottage Street with it, all of the phone wires and all of the electric wires. And my parents were safe, but it was quite a thing.
Well, that whole section there, if you look at it today, where the water goes over the dam, that was gone. That whole thing just went. And it tore through the mills, the rubber, not the rubber thread, but the dye house, where the water still runs. And it just ripped through the air like a locomotive.
Pretty much everything on the first floor of this complex was underwater. And I guess it took months before they had it straightened out where they could actually move back in. They were without power, I believe, for a month and a half after the water went down. This is how high the water was. I believe it was August 19th, 1955. And this was all from one storm, one day of rain that did all this damage. So there's a lot of power involved in water. Remember that.
Nashawannuck Pond is often referred to as the jewel of Easthampton. At the turn of the 20th century, Nashawannuck Pond and scenic Easthampton was one of the most photographed subjects of postcards for the Tuck Company. Beyond its serene majesty, the calm waters of the pond memorialize the industrial heritage of its people and will inspire the cultural and economic future. Nashawannuck Pond defines the local landscape. Its beauty commands our reverence, and it has come to embody the heart and hope of the community.
I believe Nashawannuck Pond is such a treasure because it's actually breathtakingly beautiful just to look at it. It's dreamlight, you're looking at it, you see the mountain. From my office, it looks like sparkling diamonds. And the location is also unbelievable. To have such a beautiful scenic view right in the center of your town, I think just blows most people away.
Nashawannuck Pond is a key central focus that a lot of other towns in the Commonwealth do not have. And it's both a natural resource and an economic resource because it's tied so closely to the downtown.
It's a jewel that anybody, as I did, moving into the area or coming in this area would really want to, it'll attract people to want to move or live in this area. I think it's extremely valuable that way.
Well, I didn't have the opportunity, like a lot of people in Easthampton, to swim in the pond in the summer or skate on it in the winter. I can tell you, though, that when I moved to Easthampton, it was the central location, this incredible resource. That was one of the many reasons why I moved to Easthampton.
When I think about Nashawannuck Pond, I get a feeling that it represents something special to me, that it represents, I guess, memories of my childhood to some extent, but maybe less so than a sense of place. The idea that Nashawannuck Pond had so much to do with what this community is today. The historic mill buildings in Easthampton are here because of the pond. The reuse in those buildings that is taking place now is phenomenal, and it certainly is a resurgence here in the community. And I have a reverence, I think, for the pond and for what it's done here in the community. And I just see it as something that deserves to be protected and enhanced.
It was the heart and soul of this community, of Easthampton, the people who looked back and realized what a treasure this body of water was, and what it could be, and what it should be. And everybody, it was a heart and soul effort. The Army Corps of Engineers saw that, the federal government saw that, the state government saw that. It was that this community was absolutely in love with this water body.
The pond really, especially for myself and a lot of my friends at that time, we had a lot of young families starting up on the Holyoke Street area, and we used the pond as a four-season kind of like playground.
When I was a young man, I learned how to swim at the Boathouse Beach. My sister lived next door to it, so I've been connected with the pond for years. I've lived in the community all my life, and I used to fish there and swim there and do recreational boating there. So I would hope that down the road we can improve the quality of the pond and bring it back to what some of us in town remember it, and to make it a much more useful facility.
I can remember across the pond you've got the big pines in the park, and the water was very very clean.
The history and the background of Nashawannuck Pond, it's really the story of the industrialization of Easthampton during the years of the so-called industrial age in the 1840s in this country.
And Samuel Williston actually was the individual that dammed up Nashawannuck Pond to provide hydroelectric power for his button-making manufacturing company. And so that dam was set up over there in Easthampton. This was just a big valley. And what they did is they dammed it up and created hydropower for the button-making industry.
Now, Easthampton in 1840 was a very small, rural, agricultural town with a population of only a few hundred. At the foot of what is now Union Street, was pasture land with a stream running through it, Broad Brook. Williston bought the property and he built a dam there in 1847, impounding the waters of Broad Brook and two other smaller brooks, White Brook and Wilton Brook, making what we today call Nashawannuck Pond. At that time, in the 1840s, it's important to remember, there was no electricity. Steam power was in its infancy. The only power source was falling water. The pond was dammed through a chute. The water came down, turned a turbine, which in turn turned a shaft and gear and pulley arrangement, which turned the machinery. Actually, this type of arrangement persisted well into this century. Water power was there, available, and essentially free. Now, Williston had far more water power than he could use for making buttons, so he built the other industrial plants, now known as Number 1 Cadieux Street, and the adjacent buildings. And he went into additional business of making elastic fabrics. He was one of the early people to make suspenders. It seems a little odd, thinking of industrialization, to be thinking in terms of suspenders and buttons, but that's what Easthampton is famous for elastic cloth, elastic fabrics, and buttons originally. Now, Nashawannuck Pond was used quite heavily for a number of things through the years. Very early after it was built, ice was cut from it. There was, of course, no electric refrigeration. There was an ice house built on the pond near Gough Street, probably in the 1860s or 1870s. Ice was cut in the winter, put in the ice house, and would last well into the following summer or fall. A second ice house was built also in the same area, and that stayed in business up until the 1930s, when finally electrical refrigeration, mechanical refrigeration put the ice companies out of business.
After the men finished cutting the ice, they would store it in the ice house, and they had long chutes in there, and to preserve the cold, they would use sawdust. And as a little kid, my friends and I used to sneak in there and slide down those chutes, and the men used to chase us out. And we couldn't understand why, but it was because we could get hurt in there. But a child doesn't remember that.
And in addition, the pond, probably since its earliest days, has always been a great resource for recreation. People swam in it through the years, fished and boated. There were at least 2 boathouses on the pond. Old picture postcards in the library show these boathouses. From the town beach and boathouse, there was a footbridge running across the Nashawannuck Pond, so people could go back and forth from one to the other. No trace of that remains today, and it's probably, well, we don't know when it was built, but it's probably been gone since the hurricane and flood of 1936, or perhaps older, perhaps before that. Now, on the eastern side of Nashawannuck Pond is what is called the town beach. Many years ago, and again, I can't tell you the exact date, I'm sure people in town that can, developed a very nice sandy beach there with swimming, with a bathhouse adjacent to the boathouse. And for a great many years, that was a popular swimming spot in Easthampton.
Yeah, as a youth, I grew up on Holyoke Street in Easthampton, and the pond was our summertime swimming spot.
It was a place for community to go and go to the beach, kind of like you would go to any lake or the ocean nowadays. So it was a place where people could meet and swim and play and picnic together. It was really nice.
It was fun to come down here because it was just so quiet and peaceful and nice, and mostly everybody was just here enjoying the sun and the children and the water when it was hot.
The water at that time was very clear, and there was a sandy bottom to the water, and we used to go there in the really hot summer afternoons, put a blanket down, bring a picnic lunch, and go swimming in the pond.
It was a place we gathered to enjoy the neighbors. You enjoyed the kids. You got to know all the kids in the neighborhood. You got to know a lot of people just from hanging out here.
The name boathouse, I don't know if many people realize how it originated, but I've seen old pictures where there was literally a boathouse to launch boats. And they had 2 cabanas for changing clothes, men and women, you know, one at each end. And they got the name Boathouse from that.
It was very sandy, beach sand. We had a lifeguard, you know, lifeguard chair. You know, typical. Out, they had an area kind of roped off with rope and flotation devices to, you know, so there'd be a swimming area for, you know, like younger kids.
This is the boathouse, and they, the kids used to sometimes sneak over and swim across. See that sandy spot across there? Yeah. Wasn't allowed when the lifeguards were here, but they often did that.
One of the things at the pond to become, quote, one of the guys, you know, from the neighborhood was to swim across. So I swam across the pond, and then to be a real hero, you did it to the point, which is farther over. And I ran home to my mother, and she almost killed me. She said, "You're going to drown, don't do that."
My favorite memory of that is as we were getting older and kind of trying to prove who was the best swimmer and so forth. You know, as a young kid, it was a challenge to swim from the boathouse, the beach area, across to the point at Nashawannuck Park and then back, so that we were always challenging each other to do that.
We decided to swim across. Of course, I have no swimming lessons or anything like that. So we jumped in and we're going across, and I just barely made it. You know, I'm like doing the dog paddle, and I just, you know, crawled up onto the bank. So I kind of went a few feet, and then there was a lifeguard there at the time, of course, because it was a known swimming area. She asked me if I wanted to ride back in the rowboat, so I had to take the rowboat back. It was quite embarrassing. I don't think I still haven't recovered.
During the summer, you see hundreds of kids, I mean, from all over the neighborhood, and that's how we got to know each other, you know, like that. And they came from New City, Montom, Cherry Street, you know, all over the place.
There were many children from the area that would come down. I mean, the lifeguards were so good at taking care of them. I think a lot of parents in them days used to just send the kids down. The kids used to bring the nets and catch the frogs and bring the little tadpoles home. They'd bring them home in a bucket. We'd come down with food baskets and our sodas and spend the whole afternoon here, and then the kids would go home and eat and come back again at night.
My wife's aunt, Minnie Lake, was a lifeguard there, and when I got out of the Navy, I was a lifeguard. My wife, I knew her since she was 4 years old, so she lived up the street, and they grew up. And Minnie said to me one time, which I probably shouldn't tell us, but she said, "You know, I can never figure out. I used to throw Bobby out once a day. You know, throw me out of the pond, you couldn't come back for doing something like throwing rocks or whatever. And every time she'd go down to lifeguard, she'd pass by my house, and I'd be there with my bathing suit. She'd say, 'Come on.' And she'd walk me down there, and by the end of the day, I was out of the pond or something, you know."
It became a place where you really couldn't go swimming anymore. It was too muddy and weedy, and the bottom part of where you used to go swimming became very mucky, full of leaves, and it was brown, and it wasn't very desirable to go swimming anymore.
I think they built the pool about that time, so they figured the kids could swim over at the pool.
But us guys and girls didn't always like swimming in the pool. We wanted to come and swim in the pond. So right across the way over there was a tree. A big tree overhanging the pond that had a rope in it. So we used to get on this rope swing and swing right out onto the pond, let go, and then drop down into the pond. And then with some of us, more daring, we would climb up to the top of this tree and jump right out of the tree into the pond.
The pool, you jump in and you jump out, right? Here, if you swim out too far, you're over your head and you're way out too far. Did you hear that fish? Yeah. Well, you don't find fish in the pool, that's for sure.
What I'm hoping is that the pond becomes another place where people can meet and recreate, hopefully not only to fish, but maybe they could go swimming again, and the beach can be put back like it once was.
This is what everybody asks us about. Are we ever going to be able to swim at the Boathouse Beach again? This is where we learn how to swim. My parents brought my brother and I here. There were beach towels all over the place, people swimming. You had a roped off area in the water where people would swim. All of that is gone. And what I have to say is that I can hear the splashing in the water I can see the kids swimming. I can see the beaches, this beach full of beach towels. I can see the lifeguard chair, but that's all in our memory. What we want to do is make it a memory for the kids that are coming into our lives at this point now. Let's bring that back. Okay, everybody, grab your beach balls, your beach umbrellas, and your towels, and let's go to the Easthampton Boathouse Beach. Oh my God, what happened to this place? That is exactly what a person would say if they came down here after being out of this town for 30 years. This is the Easthampton Boathouse Beach, where we used to have a lifeguard tower, where you used to be able to swim across. Take your boat out into the middle of the pond, dive out of the boat, and not even hit the bottom of the lake. And now look what happened over here. What do we have here, Gary?
Looks like a swamp.
This pond ultimately was dying due to what they call cultural eutrophication. Eutrophication is just a term used for the death of a water body. And when you say cultural eutrophication, that means that culture, man, our existence in the area is all an integral part or a factor of that eutrophic process. So cultural eutrophication means that we as a culture are contributing to the death of this water body by our involvement around it.
The life cycle of a pond, any man-made or even a natural body of water, will start with a bare, sterile bottom. Sediments are washed in, building up a layer of organic debris in which algae and other plant life can root. Ultimately, this will progress until the pond becomes a swamp and becomes dry land. In the natural scheme of things, if there were no people around and it was left to nature, this process would take between 1,000 to 2,000 years. However, human activities in the Nashawannuck Pond watershed have hurried this cycle along dramatically.
The pond actually was originally 55 acres, and now it's 35 acres.
Wow.
And that just happened in the last 50 years because all of the water that was coming into the pond from Broad Brook, White Brook over there, and in Wilton Brook, all had sediment that was being brought into the pond. So we had to be able to stop the sediment from coming into the pond. Nashawannuck Pond, if you can see this, is at the bottom of a funnel with a 10.5 square mile watershed. That means everywhere around for 10 miles, when the rain hits, it's all going to come down the streets, the valleys, the lawns, and through the drain culverts and all. Nashawannuck Pond's on the bottom of that. So it's constantly being fed with nutrients, whether it's your chemlons, your fertilizers, it could be farmland, it's all part of our culture. And what we need to do is take a look and see what's going downstream into the pond that we might be able to do a better job at. As you can see, we've got weeds, we've got algae. There used to be a bridge that used to span this pond from that point to this point over here. People used to jump off that bridge, dive into the water, not even touch bottom. You can virtually walk from this point to the other side without that water even going over your head. This is what time does to a pond. This is what sediment does to a pond, because all the sediment is coming from my right and working its way down this way. And that's what we're trying to do, is stop that sediment encroaching.
I used to run a boat on the pond during the fall festival, and for 8 years the Pascoma Conservation Trust sponsored this boat ride on the pond. The reason we stopped doing it is because the water got so shallow that we couldn't run a boat in there any longer. So about the only place you can really use a boat in the pond now, if you were to have one on the pond, is in the lower reaches. The upper reaches beyond the old boathouse beach on Water Street is now too shallow to use that kind of a boat.
What we need ultimately to do is to do the dredge, to get rid of those sediments, to increase the depth of the water so the sunlight can't make its way as far down. When the sunlight can hit the bottom sediments, it's going to create the weed growth. That's why when you look at the bowl area of the pond, you don't see as many of the macrophytes, simply because the sun is not making its way down to its bottom depths. When you go further on downstream, and where the water is only 3 or 4 feet deep, you have these massive mats of macrophytes. And the two predominant macrophytes in the pond, I'd like to be able to show you right here. This right here is called Elodea canadensis. This is one of the predominant macrophytes that are in the pond. The second most predominant macrophyte is this one right here, which is Ceratophyllum demersum, commonly known as coontail. These are the macrophytes that are approximately 75% of what is in the pond at this point. The main thing I'd like to say about the macrophytes, though, is they're not all bad. To have macrophytes in your pond is actually a good thing. It allows for fish to feed on. It allows for shelter. If you look really closely, which I'm sure you're not going to be able to, but you could find damselfly nymphs in this coontail here. You could find mayfly nymphs. Look at the pickerel weed. People look at that and say, what's that doing in our pond? Well, it's a good thing that it's in our pond because it supplies food for wood turtles. It provides food for painted turtles. It provides food for the ducks. It provides food for the muskrat. It provides shelter for the fish. If you come down here at certain times of the year, you will see massive eggs of toads and other various aquatic species. If you look a little bit closer in, over to this area, you see some arrowhead. Again, that is food. So we never want to return our pond back to a pristine state. If it becomes pristine, we're not going to be able to fish in here. We're not going to be able to have our fishing tournaments. We just have a prolific growth, and that's our major problem. We want a reduction, but not an elimination of our macrophytes.
Basically, in the summer, the sun heats the surface of the water, and what is supposed to happen in open water, it does happen, that warm water rises to the top. As the air cools off, as the water cools, it settles to the bottom and it brings up cold water and it turns the water over, which keeps the oxygen strong and fresh in the water. What happens in a pond like this one is that the weeds stop the water from turning over, so you get less oxygenation. The condition of the pond makes it more difficult for fish to live in over the summer. The other issues that are of concern at the pond are the shoreline, the stabilization of that shoreline. We have a lot of use on the pond in several areas, and the fact that people use the pond in and of itself causes problems with the pond. People have driven vehicles to the edge of the water. People, when they fish, concentrate in certain areas, and that causes the shoreline to erode and wash away into the pond.
You can see the sign that says no vehicles beyond this point. Well, I've been coming down to this place for years since those signs have been up, and I have yet to see a vehicle paying attention to those signs. You can see the tire tracks. Nobody pays any attention, and that is exactly what's going on. The soil is being compacted, and so there's no vegetation that can grow here, and so everything can just wash directly right into the pond.
In order for Nashawannuck Pond to be dredged, we need to arrest the sediment flowing in from two of its major streams, the Broad Brook and the White Brook. We took a look, and one design that they came up with is what they call a gabion weir. And what a gabion weir basically is a dam-like structure that is spread right across the brook before it enters the pond. It's wire mesh with rocks in it, and what this is supposed to do is act as a strainer, a sifter of all the downstream sediments. The White Brook flow was much, much less than Broad Brook, so we decided to analyze that particular situation first.
The gabion weir, which is basically a great big strainer made out of rocks to catch silt. This has been completed and is installed where White Brook runs into Nashawannuck Pond. It actually serves as a siltation trap to prevent the silt from running into the pond. It catches in the basin and is every so many years scooped out.
Broad Brook is responsible for approximately 73% of the flow into the pond. White Brook is responsible for approximately 7%, Williston is responsible for about 19%, and direct precipitation is approximately 1%. So even though we have this structure in place at White Brook, that was the first step, but that's also our smallest feeding stream. Once we get this siltation in on Broad Brook, we're going to be in a lot better condition than what we were previous to it.
Just think of all that sand that's put on the mountain road in the wintertime to keep those vehicles from slipping and sliding. And think about all the street sand, even on the roads that are around this area of the pond. Every single storm drain goes right into this pond. This pond is a recipient of an enormous loading of sediment. Broadbrook has 5 bridges, goes under 5 bridges on Hendrick Street alone. Each one of those bridges has a drain culvert. So when they sand the road, and they sand the mountain road, all that sand eventually comes in underneath the bridges, into the brook, and then into the pond. So that's why we lost so much acreage to Nashawannuck Pond. So we have the silt basin in place over there, which is what we did is we diverted the stream channel of Broadbrook, and we made a pond so that Broadbrook comes in, there's a pond, and then Broadbrook goes out. And when the water goes into this pond, it's a settling basin, okay, so the sediment falls down over there, and then water goes into the pond clean. So what we're have to do with the siltation basin is that we're gonna have to get heavy equipment in there and scoop that out periodically so that it doesn't come into here. So we got maintenance that we need to do over there. We've got maintenance that needs to be done over at the White Brook, Gabion Weir. So we've got 2 areas that we're gonna have constantly be scooping out sediment so that it doesn't come into the pond. I mean, obviously we just can't stop our way of life to just allow Nashawannuck Pond to be beautiful, but we can maybe alter or understand what everybody can do to sort of help out when it comes to keeping this body of water clean.
This is how it happened, basically, is Paul and myself and Mike Tautznik were all at the same party. And so that was the party to remember.
The mayor, Mike Tautznik, he first asked me if I wanted to get involved with the Nashawannuck Pond Steering Committee, and at that time the committee was brand new, and I was probably one of 1 or 2 people on it. And I originally said no, I'd rather not, because if I can't give something 100% of my effort, then I don't want to get involved at all.
And Paul is the kind of person that I am, is that if you take on a project, you really do take it on. You don't just do it half-heartedly. And so it just seemed as though there was there really was a desire to do it, but his practical side was winning out. And that took some more coaxing and a couple of more Budweisers. I think it was the brand of choice at the time.
I was standing right next to Paul while Mike approached both of us, actually, and started talking about the pond and how much it meant to all of us. And, he laid it on, but everything he said was truthful.
So he waited a little while. We were at a party, and then he came up to me and he said, "Paul, did you ever use the pond when you were a kid? Did you ever go there fishing with your father and your brother?" I says, "Yeah." "Did you ever go swimming there with your parents?" I says, "Yeah." "Well, don't you think the kids in the future might want to have what you had?"
I stuck around and I listened to Mike and Paul go back and forth with it, and the sort of the guilt trip that Mike laid on Paul. And after all was said and done, I went back up to Paul and said, "Hey, let me know how that pond thing is working out for you. I might want to join someday,
But eventually, I think he remembered the enjoyment that the outdoors have brought to him from his growing up here in Easthampton, and he recalled the pond in days that were filled with fun and not a lot of adult responsibilities or the need to worry about the level of commitment that you can give to a project. And it was something that I saw in him that just convinced me to keep trying to steer him towards the correct answer that he eventually gave me.
That was an excellent approach on his end, because he hit me in the soft spot. So my whole drive to getting this project done is really for the kids of the future, and for them to be able to experience what I grew up experiencing with this pond.
And it was one of the best things I ever did, because it actually led me to go back to college and learn about environmental science. And I'm now working at Holyoke Community College in the environmental science department, so it really changed my life.
We started with doing pond tours in order to be able to establish the pond as a public location, because prior to 1985 it was a privately held body of water, and the water rights are still held by one of the mills. And so it was convincing the town that it ought to be a public water body that allowed us to move forward, and that was a pretty Herculean effort. And prior to that, I don't know that I recognized the community support for Nashawannuck Pond. It certainly was easy to build. The idea of taking people out on a boat where they really historically had not been able to go. We had a 24-foot pontoon boat, and people could ride nice, high and dry, and they'd get a bit of a guided tour. And seeing the dumps that existed along the shoreline, the privately held shoreline at the time, really was a big eye-opener for us, and I think for a lot of citizens in the community.
This is a section where another brook runs into the pond. This time it's White Brook. And these logs in the foreground are quite prevalent everywhere in the pond, offering obstacles for boaters. Again, we have a scene close to where Broad Brook runs into the pond, and you can see a thick scum on the surface of weeds and algae.
So in 1998, and then again in 2003 when we revisited it, Easthampton undertook a visioning process, and as part of that, one of the key elements was the natural resources of the town and the special places of the town, and Nashawannuck Pond was clearly identified as one of those. The pond at that time was filling in, not just with muck, but with invasives and plants, and the importance of keeping the pond around for future generations involved cleaning the pond. So that became part of the vision, as well as how the pond related to the mills in the downtown.
When they did the envisioning process here in Easthampton, and he went around and asked, they had these forums set up here in the school, asking everybody, what is the #1 thing that you would like to see changed in this town? Is it the schools? Is it the busing? Is it the roads? Is it the lighting? Is it a whole bunch of things? And hands down across the board, everybody wanted to see Nashawannuck Pond restored. So the heartbeat of the community was all around the restoration of this water body, because everybody had some kind of memory about it. The kids learned how to swim there. I learned how to swim there. We all fished there. It's a great fishery, and it was just an overall center point to our entire community structure.
I could say that the community supported Nashawannuck Pond Steering Committee and the pond restoration project in general about 99.9%. To say that we had 100% people behind us would have been, on our part, unrealistic to expect. And of course, you're always going to find those people who just want to stir the pot for the sake of stirring the pot. But without the backing of the city, without the backing of the people, we would have never be where we are right now. There was so much fund that needed to go into place. There was so much that the councilors, in voting for additional funding, needed to hear from the people. If the people certainly didn't support it, nor would the councilors, and nor would the state and federal government, because that was something that was put into every report, was the support of the community. If the community didn't support us, we wouldn't have received the funding for project #1, never mind the dredging aspect. So we were very happy.
Well, I think with the visioning process, and which, as you know, the outcome of that was to clean it up, and then the dredging. So I think people are trying to explain how they want to keep this national treasure. They want it to be available for use and to enjoy.
It needed to be a community effort, and Paul was a great catalyst for that because he's very gregarious. He's an easy guy to talk to. I remember a lot of discussion over the years with folks that maybe didn't necessarily agree with the fact that we should spend some money to do the dredging, and invariably Paul would be persistent enough to break down the resistance, at least to the point where people would see his point of view and our point of view as opposed to just being opposition.
We got a 319 grant for this pond the first time we asked. And that's how much they saw the validity of this project. And then we got another 319 grant after that for the stormwater. And then we continually started getting grants to be able to help us with all of these things that we needed to do here.
Every time that any kind of a call was issued, citizens in the community, whether they lived in the neighborhoods around the pond or whether they lived elsewhere in the community, have come out and volunteered their time and service. We early on, we had a lot of fundraisers, we had a lot of dances. The Nashawannuck Pond Steering Committee sold T-shirts and the like to raise money, and those efforts always were well attended, and the people were very generous in their efforts.
Hi, I'm Kendra Warhurst from the Easthampton Public Schools and from Channel 13, and I'm here in Southampton at Canal Bowling Lanes. We're here for a bowl-a-thon for Nashawannuck Pond Steering Committee, and if you look behind me, you can see just how many people are here pledging their support to earn money to help save the Nashawannuck Pond. We asked several key people in the community how they felt about this bowl-a-thon.
Fantastic, Kendra. Every pin that falls is money for our cause. You know, it's great. It's never dreamed that this many people would turn out. We've got as many viewers as we have bowlers. It shows you how much interest there is in saving the pond.
And the pond is a major issue in Easthampton. Both John and I have been working to try and scrounge around and get some funding to help clean the pond, but when we weren't able to...
Scrounging around these days, too.
And when we weren't able to come up with something like that, and we made that very clear to a lot of the sponsors of the bowl-a-thon today, they said, well, we'll take it back to the people and see if it's important enough for the people of Easthampton to support something like this, and obviously it is. And
This is a fun way to raise money, too. It's, I think in times of dwindling resources, maybe these will become more and more fashionable, this type of method to raise money as the state begins to move away from some of its things that it's funded in the past. I think the people may have to get directly involved in it as they are in this one, and this is important. It's a great community show of community spirit.
Mr. Michael Tautznik, a member of the Selectmen, shares his excitement about today's bowl-a-thon.
Well, I think it's a great time. It's great to see everybody getting together. All the boards are bowling together, and everyone else helping out. We hope to raise a lot of money for the pond, and that's really what we're up to.
Mr. John Watley, key organizer for the bowl-a-thon and also a member of the Nashawannuck Pond Steering Committee, had this to say.
I'm overwhelmed. It's amazing. As I mentioned when we started this off today, I was a skeptic in town for many years, and this just proves me wrong right from the beginning. You know, the whole town community as well as the different boards are here representing the effort, and it's great. It's really good.
And how much do you expect to get out of the bowl-a-thon today?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know how much pledging the people have gotten. We want to get the pledge sheets and get an idea before the end of the day. It's going to be tough. We have a little bit of work ahead of us here to compile some numbers, but gee, it'd be guessing. It's a success, I know that, whatever it be.
For Channel 13 in Easthampton, I'm Kendra Warhurst.
It's a way for us to show our pride in the community, and it's a way for us to identify with the community.
There were many questions in the town when people were watching the dredge occur. Many thought that there wasn't enough sediment being extracted from the pond. Many people said that the dredge was a failure. You heard it all. And my response to that basically is that we had a federal grant that was a 2/3 matching grant. And we had all of the money in place federally, but we didn't have the money in place yet on our end. And it took a while for us to get that money together. One day I called the Army Corps of Engineers and had asked them a little bit more about how we're going, and then he says, well, the funds are gone, Paul. And I said, well, what do you mean the funds are gone? He says, well, the funds are gone for the dredge. It looks like they were needed for Hurricane Katrina, so we lost all our money there. And these are congressionally earmarked funds, and it was kind of like a surprise for everybody. But we had to wait, and then the following year, we were in the process of resecuring the money, and Congressman Oliver was very was capable of doing that, and we were very grateful for it. But we also found out that the cost of the project almost doubled in a matter of a year. So the longer we waited to have this project done, what everybody would say the right way, or in an ideal world, let's carve this pond out shore to shore, we need to move ahead. Otherwise, the cost of this project is going to become so exorbitant, we're not going to be able to do it at all. So we managed to have a lot of help from CPA funds. They helped with our 1/3, and we were looking at a project that was $1.3 million plus. And so we were able to extract 40,000 plus cubic yards of sediment out of the pond. We needed to move ahead with the money that we had and all the permits that we had, because if we tried to wait to do this shore to shore, it would have been unaffordable to us, and the project would have been ultimately a failure, and the dredge would have never been completed.
It's over by the boathouse there. See, they load them right onto those trucks right there. And then that truck will head out.
Most of our siltation was coming in from Broadbrook and Whitebrook, and those areas were filled in, and those areas were rightfully addressed according to the plan that was put in place. So it was a successful dredge. We did watch an enormous amount of sediment get extracted from the pond, and therefore, for the money that we had, the only money that we had, it was a job well done, and it was a success.
The structure that was supposed to hold back the water in Rubber Thread Pond let go. So we had this huge rush of water that came pouring through the tunnel and went and took a lot of the sediment over the dam with it. So instead of having clear water going over, this stuff looked like mud. So what we had to do is that we set up a sort of a temporary sediment system down beyond Rubber Thread Pond. And we basically, by the Nashawannuck Felt Committee, and they just set up hay bales and silt fencing and trapped as much of the silt as they can, which sounded all good and fine, except that once the silt is in that area, you can't go in and get it out by law. So we were trapping this sediment, and then we found out, well, that's great, guys, but there is no law that allows you to go in after it. So the reality was that we had a lot of flooding occurring, and much of the sediment went over the barrier anyways. Sediment went downstream, certainly, but nothing that damaged the environment.
Well, it all started out with, what are we going to do with the fish when we pull the plug on Nashawannuck Pond? We had these sluiceways that were actually there. One sluiceway was actually functioning, which would draw all the water out of the pond. Only so much is going to go over the dam, and then the remaining part of the pond is going to get released through this sluiceway. And in looking through the old documents of the dam's construction, there were these iron grates that were set up. They're actually called trash grates to keep things from getting plugged up in the sluiceway that then goes down into the canal leading out of the pond and going towards Lower Mill Pond. So one day I decided I was going to wake up my dive equipment and get one of my buddies, and we're going to go down there one night without virtually telling anybody, and we're going to go down there and see if we can remove this trash grate from the sluiceway, because these fish have to live. Otherwise, we're going to have one nasty fish fry in the middle of town when all the water's gone, and they're all going to die and then stink up the whole place. So, and then why kill all the fish? So I went down there with my buddy, and it was the worst scuba dive I ever had. Zero visibility, couldn't see anything. Got down there, felt the trash grate, was able to hook a chain to it, and then we were able to raise the trash grate the next day, pulling it straight up with the chain that was attached to it. So then the big day came where the Army Corps of Engineers was coming in, and they were going to some way get the fish corralled to go out this sluiceway. We got together with this net, and it was called a seine net, and this net drops down with lead weights on the bottom, so we're gonna pull this whole big giant fence of rope across the pond towards the sluiceway, and then you start corralling the fish towards the sluiceway, and all of a sudden you notice that they're going into the sluiceway and they're coming down into the raceway, and they're heading off towards Lord Mill. And so we did 3 big swipes, and it was a huge success. We corralled an awful lot of fish, including 2 big koi, which were carp-like fish. They're like goldfish, and they went out there too. And then all of a sudden, when the pond started to really get dry and empty, there were a number of fish stranded in the mud. And so Mike Tautznik and I, the Mayor Mike and I, went out there in our boots, and we're trying to move the fish into the remaining brook that was flowing in the pond. And we were grabbing fish and throwing fish and trying to do everything, and all of a sudden everybody's saying, get this one, get that one. People are up on the bank and they're going, there's one over there, there's a big pickerel, there's a big perch. And it was this big 2 carp stranded in the mud that were just about out of range. And I started going out there. And of course, the Army Corps of Engineers told me, do not go out there in that mud because it could end up being a quicksand situation and you're gone. So I was using this big net as a pick, and I was going towards the fish, and finally I got the fish into me. And I went to turn around and realized I wasn't taking another step. I was sucked in, and if I pushed down on one leg, the other one wouldn't come up, and then I started going deeper and deeper and deeper, and so all of a sudden I said to some little kid on the shore, I says, yeah, could you run out without making a lot of noise and see if you can find a ladder? You know, not a rope, I need a ladder. And so the kid goes up to the road and he goes, is somebody drowning in the mud? He's falling in, he's and next thing you know, it was fire trucks and police cruisers and ambulances just show up, and the whole street's just cordoned off, and I'm standing there going, this isn't exactly what I wanted. But anyways, the funny thing is, I tell everybody, is that when I got up on the ladder, nobody was cheering. But when I reached back to grab that fish, everybody started cheering. So across the ladder I came with this big, huge carp, and I brought it up top, and the camera started going off. There were pictures of that, and then I took the big fish and I threw it back into the brook, and down the raceway it went. I named the fish Lucky, and then that was we saved an awful lot of fish that day. It was a wonderful time. Something I was totally in my element. It was the best thing I ever did. The Broad Brook siltation basin did its job, but now it's full, and the sediment needs to be extracted. The road that went down to it unfortunately washed out, so there's no way of getting heavy equipment down there. So a new road has to get put in place. All the permitting pretty much has been completed, but it's still a huge, perhaps maybe a $200,000 project to clean up and fix this installation. And then we also have the gabion weir that is all set to go, but we also need continued funding in order to keep all these items in place so that we keep the sediment from coming into the pond. So it's a matter of public awareness. It's a matter of what are we doing in our surrounding areas, what kind of chemicals we're using, what kind of fertilizers we're using, and how are we keeping this sediment from going into the pond. These are big ticket items, and the awareness and the fundraising and it can never stop in order to keep a water body alive in a central community structure like it is now.
I think there's a lot of support for developing the economic connection to downtown. We think that creating a destination like a boardwalk along the pond in downtown is going to be good for the community from both an economic development point of view as well as to improve our stature here and to make Easthampton a destination.
So here we have our own special water body with our wonderful scenic mountain range in the background, and the city has been evolving into a lot of arts, a lot of community involvement, bringing back Easthampton into a little bit of its historical ways that it had in the past. So if you take a look at the applicability of a boardwalk, it's great. It's a magnet for community action, and it ultimately beautifies downtown. So would a boardwalk be a great thing? Sure. If you take a look at the plans, it's a wonderful project. It becomes a component to the growth of the city.
The pond has always been important to the city of Easthampton from its history as a mill pond providing power to the mills. Over time, it's been a key recreational resource for fishing and boating. But within this next phase with the boardwalk project, we're hoping to turn it into a gathering place, the gateway to the cultural district, bringing more people to our downtown, and providing a safer place for fishing, providing handicap accessible boating, which is needed in the community. And I think it's really just going to bring up the next phase of the pond and how it contributes to the character of Easthampton.
Businesses that are downtown will be supported by the pond and the boardwalk. And as a city councilor, this can only improve everything in the community.
The grant that we received this year was through the Department of Conservation Services. They are focused on building and enhancing existing parks within the state. And so this funding is coming from, is to basically build a new park and to be taken over by the Parks and Recreation Department. What the project is going to do is to have a plaza, a boardwalk, have handicap accessible boating ramps, provide areas for potentially for sculpture, for, benches.
Well, I think you will see just the beauty of the pond being enhanced, and people will be able to enjoy it at a much more extensive ability. First of all, we're looking to make it a recreation center where there would be non-motorized boats, boat rentals. People would be able to access it for, you know, handicap fishing, boat launching. But I think just walking around on, I think just sitting there would be a great place to sit there, read a book, have your lunch, and just enjoy the beauty of it.
When they see a community actually putting themselves together and saying, we're going to make a better place of our city, that attracts these grants. That attracts this help because they're going to help those who help themselves. And Easthampton has consistently proven to be a governmental entity that wanted to continually better themselves, whether it's redoing the mill structures, whether it's lamppost lighting on the streets, whether it's a proactive community, and proactive communities are going to be met with favorable eyes from the federal government.
I'm very excited about the boardwalk project. In many ways, I think it's like the setting of a diamond ring. I can't imagine a better way to highlight the beauty and magnificence of this natural gem we call the Nashawannuck Pond. I think it'll be great for downtown business. I think it'll improve the quality of life in Easthampton. I look forward to hanging out on the boardwalk, talking to old friends, and meeting new friends in the near future.
This town, a man named Sam built a dam on a stream. He used the flow to power his machine, and a village did grow in a scheme of things. When I was a kid, I hung around that good old Nashawannuck Pond, an Indian name I could never spell, but it suited our needs and it served us well. Summer and swimming at the boathouse beach, sailing our rafts till we were out of reach, fishing for punkies, perch, and calico. Those were the days we all should know. Now I've grown up and got me a son, and he's playing down there like I had done. But changes take place year after year, and the future of our pond is so unclear. They're giving boat tours to show us what's wrong. Time's running out for this dying pond. More and more people with more leisure to feed. Nashawannuck's filling up, being choked by weeds. Tell all the people who live in this town, we don't want our water to song of the